really appreciate being invited. I had a wonderful day meeting with the graduate students and all of the great practices that are in progress. I'm going to go ahead and launch. I titled my talk, Head in the Clouds, Boots on the Ground, to thinking about the tension between conceptual and physical, the physical in my art practice. And it specifically ties in with the last project that I want to show you. But I wanted to provide a little bit of context for my solo practice. So this is Niagara Falls from my series Gnawing the Record. And it's titled Gnawing the Record. I'm thinking about like gnawing on bones or scratching records to make new sounds. And so I took my vernacular photographs, like the shoebox of chromogenic prints underneath my bed, and I went through and I sorted through what was really important, and it turns out not much of it was, right? It's mostly just this sort of residue from life. And so I became interested in that and interested in the pictures that were sort of about pictures. And I selectively shredded using my Identity Guard shredder, and then sort of paste back together the pieces. And they never sort of go back the same way. So again, I think about it in terms of like remixing music. This is Tower of Pisa. This is a detail from a sunset piece. So again, I'm selecting the pictures that are really iconic and sort of point to the reasons why we collectively all make pictures, right? That there's certain things that are sort of so stunning that even though it's a cliche in so many ways, you still have to make your own document. This is graduation 1997, and there are probably about 20 of me in this, and I'm probably the size of about an eighth of an inch. My head is about an eighth of an inch. So in this, I'm thinking about how my father pointed his camera into the crowd of thousands and thousands of graduates and made 36 exposures of me graduating, even though you can barely see me in any of the pictures. But again, it's this event that we're compelled to make photographs, right? Because it's this memorialization, this sort of cultural thing that we do. This is whale watching too, and it's very much like the graduation piece, I think, because this is from going out on the harbor, going off the coast of Boston and looking at whales. And again, you come home with 36 exposures, which are basically blue with this tiny bit of flipper. And then what to do with all of that material, right? So maybe make something new. Shifting to a different project, I was sort of moved to go from my personal history to think more about social histories. And this project is titled Material Histories. For this piece, I walked about 2 miles down 7th Avenue in Phoenix, Arizona. The titles of the pieces are The Place and The Distance That I Covered. And as I go on a walk, I'll pick up every artifact that I find along my path, and I'll take those materials back to my studio and photograph them and scan them individually, and then bring them into these giant montages. So they're life size. So they end up being like the piece is actually about that big, and it's almost like you're going on a walk yourself as a viewer because it's such a big piece. And I think about them as being kind of narrative because they all sort of point back to the place that they came from and all of the people that have passed those places and the small, very, very small histories, very, very small stories that they tell. There's a newspaper clipping about first ladies with Michelle Obama on it. There's a script from a newscaster. There's a bottle of anxiety medication. And this piece was actually made on Christmas Eve. So there's also lots of signs of Christmas. This is 4 city blocks the day after Halloween. And I was really impressed with the volume of material that sort of falls outside of the natural places we think it is. We think that the world is really tidy and that we neatly throw things away where they belong and that they go somewhere where they belong. But in fact, so much of the material, so much of the content of our lives ends up sort of in public places in ways that we would never expect. I'm not really, I photograph these objects in a way that I think is really, that I think makes them really beautiful. So even though this work is definitely ecologically concerned, obviously I want us to be thinking more carefully about what we make things out of, what we use, how we discard it. But at the same time, I'm really fascinated by the objects, and I feel like I have to sort of come clean about that. I get really excited by the objects. And in that way, I feel like I'm sort of a contemporary archaeologist. Like I'm working on my own culture in the time that I'm living. And in fact, all of these layers, this is a piece that was made a little bit differently. Instead of going on a linear walk and measuring the distance, I just covered about a quarter square mile and gathered everything up because it was so dense, it didn't even require moving very far at all. This is the Rio Salado Habitat Restoration Area, if you can believe that. And so I am really interested in them as objects and think about them in terms of being sort of one slice in this layer cake of artifacts that we're producing in our landfills. And I think that these sort of records that we're leaving are going to point to our culture, and they're going to describe our culture, whether or not this is the way that we want to be described. This is part of what we're leaving. And this piece is also a little different. It's just a 1 square meter, and again, so they're life size, and it's on an empty lot. And I sort of liked the shattered artifactness of it, the nails, the bits of glass, and it's sort of like I'm taking a vacuum to the city and including everything that I find, just dumping out the bag in the studio when I get home. So that's a little bit where I'm coming from as a solo artist. The project that I want to focus on, I'm going to give you a little bit more context about my collaborative practice, and then I'm going to focus on one project for most of the talk. I have been collaborating with my partner for 10 years now, and we developed this symbol to describe our relationship that we build on the common ground. We use the Venn diagram as our symbol for the collaboration. So we're drawing on the common ground, the ideas that we share and the questions that we have in common. And then we're also trying to lean on the differences, the places that are on the sort of the things that make us unique, the different strengths that we bring to the practice. I want to show a couple of examples of earlier works that we've collaborated on. This is called As Above, So Below. And we've both independently for a long time been thinking about boundaries. Me through ecology, thinking about cycles of matter and the interrelationships between things, and Damon mostly through Buddhist philosophy that is also very much about interdependence. And so we became excited about, again, using a shredder, which has this interesting relationship between, the shredder is this contemporary object, right, that is telling of our time, because we still have physical records, but so much is being digitized at the same time. But we have to sort of encrypt our own physical records so that our identities can be protected. And I'm kind of playing on that, the relationship with photography and identity in using a shredder. But in this case, we're actually weaving the shreds instead of just sort of pasting the shred marks side by side. And we use the intersection that occurs hundreds and hundreds of times in each piece as the inspiration for the source of the imagery. So we're looking at different kinds of intersections, different kinds of boundaries. In this case, a ground-sky relationship. And we chose a sort of fuzzy edge of the horizon, and the ocean being an especially fuzzy edge, right, where the water is one of the constituents of the clouds, and then the clouds are also what makes the ocean. That's sort of what they look like up close. So you see two things at once because half of the information is covered up by the other image. And we moved from weaving. We also spent a lot of time working with the body boundary, or working with our own physical bodies and combining figurative imagery together. But we moved from weaving to interlacing shreds. And in this case, you see all of the information. Half of the information isn't hidden. This is solar arc, and it's a way to look at a year in a single image. What we did, what you're looking at, you can see these sort of amorphous white blobs, right? And if you look closely, there's 4 of them. Then there's these little tiny white dots. The little tiny white dots are actually just lens flare, but the big amorphous white blobs are the sun, 4 suns at noon on both the solstices and the equinoxes. So we went out on each of the Earth's most extreme points along its orbit, and we photographed the sun at noon, and then we combined those 4 pictures into a single picture. So it's a way of visualizing the Earth's orbit. It's a way of sort of encapsulating an entire year in one picture. And we're really interested in the really physical ways of working, really the physicality of the working method. And one of the images had a contrail, had a sort of a cloud from a plane going through it, so that slices through the images. The project I want to focus on tonight is brand new. This is actually only the second time that I'm talking about it, so hence my looking at my notes periodically, because it is really fresh for me. It's called Ground Truth Corona Landmarks, and we've been working on it for about a year, and we're only probably 10% of the way complete with it. So it's going to be a very long-term project. Some of the decisions that we've made are firm, but some of the things we still have yet to try. And it involves not only making images, but also historical research. It's an interdisciplinary project in a very different way than some of my other work has been interdisciplinary, in terms of like fiber combining with photography, for example. This is more interdisciplinary in terms of content. So the project started with this article, which was a New York Times blog, and it was referencing these sites in China that the article theorized were calibration marks for satellites. And the article made mention of a mark next to a highway in Arizona that was also believed to be a mark made on the ground to be seen from space from a satellite. So we visited it out of curiosity. We found this, we used Google Earth and GPS, and we found this mark. And it was supposed to be the mark, we thought. But as we did more research, we discovered a grid of 256 such marks in the Sonoran Desert, near where I live in Phoenix, Arizona, just south of where I live. This is a finished work from our new series. It's the first site we visited, though it took several different drafts to establish our methodology. And this mark on the ground is made of concrete with a sort of metal emblem at the center, which you'll see later. It's 60 feet across, and each arm is 25 feet long. And it's 16 feet, that each arm is 16 feet at the widest. And they're roughly oriented in 4 directions. Our research uncovered that these were part of the Corona Project, a joint CIA Air Force declassified program that developed the first imaging spy satellite, the first images made for spy satellites. And it's really interesting for us that it's this sort of geopolitically significant space, but it's also very local for us. They're calibration targets. So they're used as a reference to interpret satellite imagery made to be seen from space. We found it really fascinating that they're large landmarks, but they're relatively unnoticed, that you could have a grid of 256 60-foot diameter crosses in the desert that no one really knows about or cares about or talks about. And we're interested in how they were originally markers of space, but now they're poignant markers of a special time in geopolitical history, right? When this project was actually launched right after Sputnik, like 2 weeks after Sputnik. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. You can actually, this is a Google Earth image, and this is to sort of give you a sense of the scale of the grid that we're working with. It's a 16-mile grid, 1 per mile, and so in the field we can sort of use the intersections to our advantage, and we can use our odometer, and once we find one, then we know when the next one should be, etc. They're actually near the ruins of the Hohokam. It's near this town called Casa Grande, which is named after these important ruins of an earlier civilization. And we're kind of interested in how this is, again, a sort of contemporary archaeology, and that our grid is also something like an archaeological grid. Why in the desert? Largely because of the lack of vegetation in most cases and our very thin atmosphere. So these things were made to be seen from space, and our atmosphere is really conducive to that. The space is really kind of strange right now. It's very much in transition from desert to agriculture, but then now to developments. So in the space of a recent field work that we were doing, we drove by a field of lambs and then a field of palm trees, and all of this was happening just a couple of miles away from an In-N-Out burger. So it's very strange. It's a very transitional space. Again, it's space that, except for the people who actually live there, no one really cares about. And we're interested in how you can see the signs of the changes in the images themselves. So again, they're landmarks, but they're also time markers. You can see the shifts in vegetation. Apparently, since this was a covert operation, essentially what happened is they were working on, during the time when Sputnik was launched, they were working on electronic transmissions from space, but they weren't nearly ready. And so it was sort of a judgment call to speed up the program. And so they combined Air Force and CIA people together, and they developed this system of sending physical film, photographic film, into space, and then bringing it back down and catching it with jets. I'm not kidding. I'm going to show you this later. It's pretty bizarre, but it was sort of a low-tech solution a high-tech, low-tech solution in order to speed up the process of the surveillance. In literature, we found out that when they decommissioned the project, that the land that had been leased, basically the people went and asked if people wanted these landmarks removed. So many of them have been removed, and we plan to photograph the sites where they've been removed as well. And one thing that's sort of an unknown is that we don't know what they told people they were doing, because obviously this was a classified operation, and so they had to lease the land from people to be able to build them, and then have the Army Corps of Engineers build these massive, massive things. And they were telling people something, and we don't know the answer to that yet. This is what the markers at the center of each, and they're sort of marked along a grid like AD 49, AD 50, AD 51, etc. This is another part of the history that we're still at a loss about. Each of the landmarks has like a manhole, usually with something growing in it because it's a low place where water gathers. So it's become habitat, but we don't know the original function of the manholes. And again, they're sort of decaying to different degrees. Sometimes, like in the case of this one, we find using GPS and Google Earth, which is kind of an excavation in itself, like excavating through the layers of the photographs on Google Earth. But we found the site where this thing was supposed to be, and there was a cluster of mesquite trees. And so then it becomes actually going through the mesquite trees and trying to flush out and find the landmark within it. We don't know how we're going to photograph things like that, for example. But we did actually find this one. And again, the project was declassified by the Freedom of Information Act in 1992, and then the images were declassified later than that. Again, it ties the local to the global and history to current issues. It's really significant. We have a lot of political content abuzz in the air regarding drone warfare, right? And the politics of seeing from above. And the Corona project, which these were a part of, is really the very beginning of those politics, where you have significant investment being made in seeing from above. To understand a little bit more, I want to look at a little bit of history, and I want to show you some short excerpts from this film called A Point in Time, the Corona Story. It's a 1-hour film on YouTube. I can kind of geek out on this stuff. I don't know if you could sit through it, but once you get, you'll see.
And when the Agena went into its downward attitude, we were able to eject this from the Agena out of orbit. Once we got into that return trajectory, the thrust cone here was ejected, and this allowed the parachute to come out. This is the parachute cover. Allowed the parachute to unfurl, and that lifted the capsule out. This is the capsule. This portion with the heat shield, this all happened after re-entry, was thrown away after it did its job on re-entry, and this is the recoverable capsule that we were after.
Aircraft from the 6593rd Test Squadron raced to the proper coordinate. The first 2 attempts missed, but on the 3rd try, the capsule was air-snatched by Pelican 9, adding still another first to Corona's history, aerial recovery. Although the initial photography was substantially lower in resolution than that from the U-2, it was of intelligence value. This one mission yielded more photographic area coverage than the total of all U-2 missions over the Soviet Union. More importantly, the mission covered areas never previously reached, and a new age of technical intelligence had begun. In 1967, the final evolution of the Corona camera took place. Although the J1 was performing almost perfectly, it had been developed to the limit of its potential. The J3 was designed to eliminate vibration, improve resolution, and improve calibration data. The sophistication for command response gave the J3 much greater versatility. The history of the J3 improved the intelligence quality substantially and proved to be even more reliable than the excellent J1. However, the real test of the improvements can be seen in the evolution of image quality. On the earliest Corona missions, A target image of 25-foot resolution was all that was obtainable. But as lenses, stability, and film technology improved, the images resolved smaller and smaller detail until with the J3, image resolution was down to 5 or 6 feet. This quantum improvement significantly improved both the amount and quality of intelligence derived from the Corona product. Then, in 1968, tests proved the value of color in infrared imagery. Photographs from space could detect crop and environmental conditions of value to strategic intelligence.
So I wasn't joking about the planes catching the film, and in fact, the capsules were weighted such that if the planes didn't catch them, they were designed to have something dissolve and they would sink to the bottom of the ocean so that no one could get that data. The film is an interesting record in itself. The film was made for internal uses, and then it was declassified later. And again, it's kind of a voice of authority. It's very nationalistic, and it's an artifact of its own time as well.
The list of Corona firsts is unparalleled. The first recovered objects from orbit. First to deliver intelligence information from a satellite. First mapping from space. First stereoptic pictures from space. The first satellite to employ multiple re-entry vehicles. And the first reconnaissance program to pass the 100+ mission mark. And not least, the first photography from a satellite.
What exactly our targets were doing is still something of a puzzle for us. We know that they were used for calibration, and the term ground truth refers to the fact that you have to have something that is measured, that you know the dimensions and you know the specifics of, to be able to compare it with an image taken remotely, and to be able to interpret that image. And so our landmarks were used for ground truthing of these satellite images, and particularly that last camera, the J3, I think it was, where they were really kind of drilling down on the resolution of the spy images. So again, we're using Google Earth at home, and in some ways we're sort of reversing the process. Rather than being on the ground and then sending something up to space, and then verifying it out on the ground. Instead, we start in space, essentially, on our home computers with Google Earth, and then we ground truth from the space images. We ordered a USGS image from 1966 to find sites that may no longer be there, and we haven't had a lot of luck with that yet. But we think we've identified about 2/3 of the suspected locations. And again, it's a kind of visual excavation. Oh, and those dots were the grid that were identified. Our process involves a 16-foot boom. And so essentially we use Google Earth and GPS on our phones to tag a spot and drive to it. And then we set up, after we measure from the center and decide the vantage, we want this to be a pretty tight typology, but at the same time, we want to make the most stunning images that we can make. And so there's certain things about it that are tight and certain things that are more free. And the vantage, which sort of direction we're looking around the radial subject, is a variable. We've decided that it's important that when we go there, we be able to make the strongest image that we can make. But we always keep the horizon the same, and we keep the scale of the landmark the same by doing measurements from the center. We use a GoPro on the end of our 16-foot boom because we're using a medium format camera with a digital back, and it doesn't have tethered live view mode. So we can't see what we're doing when we first put it up there. So to get everything level, we're using a GoPro, and then we're bringing it back down, and then we're putting our camera back up. and we're tethered to our laptop where we can see the template that we have for our horizon and whatnot. And we have to, of course, level everything, level the boom. This is actually the first draft of what we were working on, and partly it was the limitations of the tools, but we really wanted to move past straightforward description. And I know it doesn't seem like a big shift, but we think that by privileging the sky, by creating an image that's really a vertical landscape, it gets much more to the core of the purpose of these landmarks, and it allows for a little bit more metaphor in the work. That I'm interested in how the skies become these pressing spaces that they're sometimes they're empty, sometimes they're full, but in fact they're always full of the invisible things that we shoot into space that are still all up there, including all the corona detritus, right? And electronics transmissions and things that we can't see, they're always full. And I think there's a real vulnerability in standing next to an X marks the spot target. There's a vulnerability implied there that I think is relevant for thinking about what's going on in the world in terms of people being seen from space. To show you a few more. This location is a little bit different because it involves some pretty serious elevation, and so it's built out of rock. Essentially, instead of hauling the concrete and the water, probably the water is the heaviest element of all. Instead of that, they sort of made this mortar and then filled it in with rocks, which is kind of amazing that they can actually see that in space. We enjoy this relationship between the moon and the radio towers, and there's a contrail in there as well. And so this is kind of how they constructed this one that's in the high place. We found a few of these so far. We always end up in conversation with, or not always, but we often end up in conversation with people who live there when we're making this, because it's a bit of a spectacle with the 16-foot boom and the laptop and everything. And usually people don't know the history. They just know that there are these things out there that were created by the Army Corps of Engineers, because that's what it says on the stamp. So it's been kind of fun to tell people a little bit of the story. Some of the places are more inhabited than others. And again, it's sort of this footnote in this massive history. So the massive history that is the Cold War. And it's sort of telling that, again, 256 60-foot diameter things in the desert are basically a tiny, tiny reference point in what is this massive history. And that sort of implies something about the degree of investment, cultural investment that was part of the Cold War. And again, I like this relationship in the work between remote knowledge and body knowledge, that there's something very different about having your boots on the ground, that there are things that you can know about a space that you can only know about it from being physically present, and versus sort of knowing things at a distance, knowing things from your screen, from your computer screen. And I think that's part of the metaphor that we're interested in drawing out. We are stitching the images together from several views. Partly that's to get at the scale that we're interested in because of the limitations of our tools. And partly, sometimes they're really tricky keeping the telephone poles, the perspective of the telephone poles, for example, keeping the telephone poles really straight, etc. But this is a really large piece. I think it's like 42 by 53, something like that. The process is really beautiful too. We end up waiting a lot. It's sort of light sensitive work. We have to be in the right position with regards to the sun so that our shadow isn't in the image. And there's a lot of waiting for clouds, waiting for special light. And that's another kind of thing that you know with your senses, that you know with your body. Waiting for transitions, waiting for important moments photographically. And we're standing in the field holding computers in our hands. Our cell phones are stronger computers than they had available in the biggest rooms you can imagine at the time when these things were built. So we have all this power. My partner made this video just recorded it from an online site over a 2-hour period. These are Iridium satellites, communication satellites for voice and data. And it's just one layer of several layers of, the satellites are sort of stacked in vertical layers above the Earth in different strata of the atmosphere. And so again, just thinking about boundaries and this connection with the ideas in our earlier work, thinking about how we're all always being watched from above. And the Earth at this point really looks like a sphere surrounded by fireflies, really. You know, we're totally surrounded by these image-making tools. And the way that cameras in space blur traditional political boundaries. So in this video from the International Space Station, we're traveling from the United States into Mexico. So there's Baja, California that we're passing over right now. And the way I'm interested in the way that technologies both enforce and dissolve how we place ourselves globally and influence our awareness of self. And that's the end of the show. Yeah? Thanks. Questions?
I have a question. You mentioned that there's hundreds of them.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if quantity in that sense is important for you guys, and you're going to go to each of the process?
Yeah, we are planning on doing it's 256 sites. So we feel like it's doable. It's ambitious, but I feel like there's something about the nature of the project that demands it being a complete archive. Because it's this particular slice of time where these things are probably going to be dug up, right, for developments. There are already many of them missing because of agriculture. So it's a kind of slice of time, and now is important. And now also in relation to global politics, I think it's an interesting time to be thinking about that history, but thinking about it in the present. Yeah, it's going to take us a long time. What do you think? Do you think it's important?
It feels like it.
Feels like it?
I also wanted to ask you, before you did so much about looking, distance, and images, there are images about image making.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, how is the viewer going to encounter, how is that going to look for the viewer when the project is more complete?
Yeah.
What's going to be the size? Are you guys making a grid, if you know anything about?
Yeah, we have, we're starting to think about that more concretely. We have two sizes of the images. One for most of the images is, I think it's 20 by 24-ish. So they're still large enough that you can sort of read details in the landscape and get a sense of scale. Because that's really important, and even in our largest images, the sense of scale is kind of, it's hard to read without a person standing in, right? So sometimes there's a rusty barrel or something that's more concrete. And then we have the picture that's more like the size of the whiteboard vertically. So we have some that we want to make really, really large to give a more palpable impression of that scale and the monumentality of it and all of that you can really enter. And then we have the smaller scale for the volume is what we're thinking. I have this secret fantasy of this show that happens where we actually get some of the artifacts from the Corona project and we exhibit the work with other artifacts, for example, like a capsule. In some of the sort of the way that I contextualized it here with some history, because I think it's a project that can go places outside of an art context. And that's
not secret anymore.
So I've spoiled my secret. But I think it would be really interesting, for example, to see this like in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum with artifacts from NASA, with some of the 16 millimeter film, etc. So I spoiled my secret.
Yeah. I have a question. When I was looking at the shape of those big objects, they remind me of the air raid symbol.
Totally.
Is it the same one? I didn't want to turn on my phone and compare it.
Totally. We had the same kind of impression, and so the bomb shelters, right? Fallout shelters, and also the symbol for. I think that's a different symbol from the symbol for radioactivity,
right?
But it's very visually closely related.
Okay.
And it is different. I think that I'm trying to remember now, but I think that the arms flute out
a little bit
more.
But with cement, if I was going to do that, that's very hard.
It's sort of ornate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it looks like the air raid nuclear fallout symbol.
Yeah, it does. And it's part of this visual language of the Cold War era in a way that even if it's not exactly that, I feel like it sort of fits in with that, the architecture and the design of the Cold War era.
So when you take your Prius up to the airport tomorrow, along Highway 195, there are these triangles along the road. They're silver, and they have no markings on them. And it turns out they're escape routes in case we have a nuclear fallout. You're supposed to follow those symbols. For a long time, I could never figure out, what are those signs? Why are they still there? Why don't they write something on them? I don't know what to do with that sign.
Right.
And that's what they are.
Interesting. I'll have to look that up. That's really exciting, actually. Yes.
You said that you got the idea from an article about China.
Yeah.
Do all nuclear countries have these things in their, these
satellite calibration symbols? I really don't know enough about it to answer your question. I would imagine that there are lots of these symbols out there, and one of the places I would look for them for more information about that would be the Center for Land Use Interpretation. They have this website that's really incredible, and this is research that I should do, so thank you for your question. Again, there's so much that we're learning, and there's making the photographs, and then there's learning, and there's the folder of documents on my desktop, right, of articles. But Center for Land Use Interpretation has a really amazing website of human interventions in the landscape, so not necessarily art, but all kinds of interventions. And they probably would have some more information about that, about just satellite calibration targets in general.
You come from Mexico?
I went to graduate school there.
So you know about the Manzano Mountains?
I have hiked there.
They're supposed to be hollowed out.
Really?
Yeah. With giant, they were supposed to be giant nuclear
Fallout
silos.
shelters. That's bizarre.
And there's big chunks where you still can't fly over the mountains. And they have, it's huge. And it seems like the scale is something, you know, is the connection
Connected.
here,
Yeah.
because it all came from the 50s.
Yeah. Yeah, these were actually made in 66 to 68. Those are the stamps that we found so far on those emblems. So it's more towards the end of the refinement of the resolution when they built these things. Yes.
Has any of your research led to like how these were actually built? Like, I imagine there was some like amount of secretive like
Right.
aspect to like the buildings. So like they're saying they got small trucks and like just a couple people building them all.
They have Army Corps of Engineers stamped on it, and so I believe the Army Corps of Engineers built them. They're very level, so they had to have some machinery to do some raising of the land. And I did read that they had to lease the land from different sources. Actually, about a third of these are on native land. So one of the things that's going to be interesting in the project is our negotiation of that invisible boundary of, sort of invisible political boundary of the reservation. We're actually going to have to get permission to be photographing on the reservation. So how they convinced people to allow them to build these things, for what purpose, we don't know the answer for that still. And beyond just sort of, sensual data taking about how we can see how they built them, with the rocks, for example, in the high places. Yeah. Any other questions?
It would seem like since 1968, there would be some landholders that would still be owning that same land.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we would like to actually interview people who are involved in the building and also find out the answer. I think the only way we're going to find out the answer of what stories were told
to the people
who own the land. I think the only way we're going to get that is basically from some of those people.
And that's public record, who owns what land.
Yeah, so again, it's a big research project. It's not just the photographs, it's all of these other layers to be able to answer your questions. And we're just getting started, really. Well, thank you very much.